we'll get started. My name is Caitlin, and I'm with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, although I wear many hats. And so welcome to our Native Prairie Speaker Series. We do about 6 of these a year in person in small towns in southwest Saskatchewan, and we're always excited to be in Dakota at Grasslands. It's always delightful to be here. There's coffee and squares over there, so please feel free to help yourself throughout the presentation. I'm really excited to be able to introduce Julia. Julia Putt is with Grasslands National Park, and we'll be speaking about grassland songbirds this evening. Before we get going, I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they've worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I'd like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. I'd also like to note that PCAP's Native Prairie Speaker Series is a monthly presentation about anything to do with prairie conservation or species at risk. We do webinars online or also in person, so feel free to check out the PCAP website for listings of upcoming events. We also have an in-person event happening late February in Fern Mountain, and it's kind of a species at risk workshop. There's a supper there. It's a joint event with Nature Saskatchewan. We have a Prairie Scott Publicity Week event coming up in March. It's an online webinar series about all the benefits that Native Prairie provides, Native Prairie pastures, that sort of thing. And we have a webinar about whooping cranes happening in March, so you can check that out online as well. Most of our past presentations can be found on the YouTube channel, and I'll be trying to record this one as well, so it'll be available online for people that aren't able to attend. And just a reminder to anyone who has questions, I just ask you to save your questions for the end of the presentation, and we'll do a Q&A afterwards there. And I'd just like to take a moment to note that financial support is provided by Environment and Climate Change Canada, and in-kind support is provided by Grasslands National Park. And I'm pleased to introduce Julia. Julia Putt is a Resource Management Officer at Grasslands National Park, and she's been at the park for 4 years and leads the sage-grouse, songbird, and bat programs on the Species at Risk team. She has her Master's of Science, and she studied the effects of organic farming and agricultural landscape composition on bat activity. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Julia.
Thank you. Okay, so my talk today is called This Grassland is Just Right, Monitoring and Conserving Grassland Songbird Species that choose different habitat. And this is a chestnut-colored longspur, which you'll hear more about. So I'm going to start kind of how all these grassland songbird talks start, just highlighting that grassland songbirds aren't doing very well. So this is from the State of Canada's Birds Report. So on the vertical axis, this is where we have the trends, and it's starting from 1970, and this one goes until 2022. But grassland songbirds, or grassland birds, are the group of the birds that's doing sort of the most poorly. And just to break down grassland songbirds or grassland birds a little bit more, the native grassland specialists are actually doing the worst. So 90% decline over that time period from 1970 to now. So in particular, those species that rely on native grassland are just doing really poorly. So Grasslands National Park is the first and only national park that represents the mixed grass prairie. Temperate grasslands are the most endangered biome on the planet. In addition to supporting abundant biodiversity, native grasslands also provide carbon sequestration and a range of other benefit and ecosystem services. So this is from Grasslands National Park.
Okay, I saw him.
And Grasslands National Park is unique, and there's other areas that are also large tracts of prairies that have been preserved, but there has been a lot of loss of native prairie. So this land classification product is from the government of Saskatchewan called the Prairie Landscape Inventory. It distinguishes native prairie from other land cover types. So the red here is all native prairie in southwestern Saskatchewan. So in southwestern Saskatchewan, we actually have quite a bit more native prairie left actually than some other areas in Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan. In Saskatchewan, there's less than 14% of native prairie left. But in southwestern Saskatchewan, we have about 34% as of 2021 at least. So it is a bit higher in this area. I just wanted to go through the different types of habitats that the birds have in the park. So in the upland grasslands, this can kind of look relatively simple, really defined by grass, but it is quite preferred by a lot of different species. So chestnut-colored longspurs like upland grasslands, Sprague's pipit, Barred sparrow, grasshopper sparrows, western meadowlarks, and upland sandpipers. We also have lowland grassland in the park. This is often short grass and shrub habitat, and this allows for easily accessible ground cover and perching opportunities. So grouse really like this habitat, so sharp-tailed grouse, sage grouse like these areas, but they're also really great for species like lark buntings and marbled godwits. The Frenchman and Rock Creek River, the rivers and the coulees have riparian buffers where small trees and shrubs grow along the banks, but beyond what you might expect, like waterfowl and marsh-loving birds, different swallows can be foraging. So big swallows are actually, they're nesting in the riverbanks, but then there's also barn swallows and cliff swallows that might use infrastructure like bridges. So you might see them around there too, and also the loggerhead shrike. They seek out that shrubland habitat that's near coulees and rivers as well. Badlands, buttes, and bear paw. So it's a pretty big, diverse category actually, but kind of generally these are hilled open areas with dry, rocky features that formed by glacial activity. So in these areas you might see rock wrens, spurs, blackbird, vesper sparrow, and prairie falcons. And then the last one I wanted to highlight is prairie dog colonies. So these are defined by dense systems of burrows interspersed with short vegetation. So a lot of raptors actually like these areas, and some shorebirds. So Frisian's hawk, for example, really like hanging out there, and also long-billed curlews. And then some songbirds actually prefer areas that don't have a lot of vegetation, so like horned larks. And then of course burrowing owls nest in burrows, and it's a really good place to see burrowing owls in the park. And with over 40 species at risk, Grasslands actually has the second most amount of species at risk of any national park in Canada, and 10 of these species at risk are actually grassland songbirds. So each grassland songbird is sort of looking for slightly different habitat structure. So some of these species have a really narrow range of suitable habitat that they're seeking, and other ones are a little bit more broad. There can also be other factors that they're selecting for, like for example, Sprague's pipit. They're actually selecting for large tracts of native prairie, so they're a little bit more limited in where they can find habitats. I'm going to highlight 4 grassland songbird species in particular. So I'm going to highlight chestnut-colored longspurs, barred sparrow, Sprague's pipit, and thick-billed longspurs. So all these species have experienced dramatic population declines and are dependent on native grasslands. Where native grassland is present, these species are relatively common, however. So these are all ground nesting birds that migrate here in the spring to breed, and they eat insects and seeds. They all overwinter in the US and Mexico. These populations are somewhat nomadic, so with breeding populations shifting locations from year to year because they're responding to drought, fire, and grazing activity. This causes fluctuations in their abundance in a given location year to year. And I guess I'm purposefully not showing you like really close-up images that might be more appealing, just because you're never probably going to see that. You might never actually see a Sprague's pipit. They're almost never on the ground photo ready. So anyways, don't want to give you a false sense of security. It's too close. Okay, so the first one is the chestnut-collared longspur. So on the species at risk act, this one is actually endangered. The name longspur refers to its unusually long hind claw on the species and others in its genus. And it's named after that chestnut colored patch on the back of its neck. It's impossible to say chestnut colored. Anyways, it's a tricky one, but it is that chestnut colored patch that it's named after. And so this is a male in the photo. So these males, they have the black belly and this buffy throat and then the chestnut colored patch on its neck. As I mentioned, the females look different. So the females are a bit more, they're not quite as brilliant looking, but they're kind of have brown and tan kind of colors overall. And these species look a little bit like sparrows, but they're not particularly closely related. And the males, in the summer, they do these big display flights. So they fly to about 15 meters high in the air, and then they spread their tail feathers out, and then they sing while they're descending. So they're really kind of like putting on a show out there for the ladies. And I was just going to play the songs as well. So the song of this species is a jumble of sweet whistled notes that descend slightly. Okay, bear with me.
Oh, okay. At least she's nice to share with you. I probably would. So,
Okay. Not loud enough. Okay, I'll play that again. So it's pretty soft. But you can imagine a bird flying up into the air and spreading its wings and definitely making its presence known.
tricking me. I'm going to forget to put my coat on because spring.
Exactly. You won't forget for long.
No.
Okay. So I'm just going to talk about the habitat for these species as well. So these ones breed in pretty short grass with sparse open vegetation. They're attracted to really heavily grazed areas or recently burned grassland. Since they like disturbed habitat, they're often in different locations from year to year. And they're pretty clumped together often because they're taking advantage of like that really sort of narrow habitat preference they have. So they can be pretty abundant where you do find them. And this photo was taken in 2023, and it's in an area in the east block of the park where there was a wildfire in 2021. So it's grown back quite a bit, but there's very little vegetation litter that's built up at all. So I'm going to talk about how these species are doing a bit more. So on the left side, this is, I'm just going to turn this off. On the left side, this is from that same report I talked about earlier, so from the State of Canada's bird report. And it's showing on the vertical axis an index. And this index is from the Breeding Bird Survey. So this is a road-based, long-term continental survey that focuses on measuring breeding bird abundance at 50 stops along a 40-kilometer long transect. So these transects are really throughout North America on the roads. And the index represents the estimated average abundance of that species on the Breeding Bird Survey route run in a given year by an average observer where the species occurs. So if you're doing one of these bird survey routes and you're doing your 50 stops, so what this is sort of saying, on average, around maybe 50 of these birds you would have observed on that route in 1970. But now you might have one or maybe two, so that's a humongous decline. And so I actually do the route that goes to Mancota, so this is kind of, I guess, a personal connection to me here, because I go through here every spring, so if you do see someone with a clipboard and binoculars, that might be me. But you can see that, baselines kind of shift, because back in the 1970s, someone doing that same route might have had way more birds, right? So the whole baseline of what people are used to has shifted. So bird sparrow is next. So for the Species at Risk Act, their special concern. So this sparrow has yellowish and brown colors with black and chestnut colored streaks. So those streaks are pretty distinctive. The V-shaped, thick, sort of light line that's running from its bill and kind of goes downward and then goes to the back of its neck, I find is kind of distinctive. Kind of looking for it's subtle with sparrows, I guess. Sometimes birders actually refer to sparrows as like little brown birds because they're not very distinctive. However, they do often have really distinctive songs. So I'm just going to play the song of the bird sparrow.
So, yeah.
That probably is a male, but they look the same. The females and the males look the same, but sometimes males like to kind of perch up and like be a little bit more conspicuous. So my guess is it would be, but you can't tell based on the coloration. Yeah. Hopefully I do better at the speakers.
Okay, cool.
This is their song. So it's one or two high introductory notes followed by a delicate wavering trill. People like to come up with mnemonics for what birds are saying, I guess, when they're singing. So for this one, it's sing, sing merrily. But I don't know if I hear that, to be completely honest. So it's up to you to decide if you can do that. But yeah, the delicate wavering kind of trill at the end is quite distinct for that one. So for their habitat, they're looking for something a bit different than the chestnut-colored longspurs. So this was a site that had high amounts of bird sparrow. So there's relatively high litter at this site. There's not very much bare ground, and there's sort of moderate levels of vegetation height and density. This site was sort of like lightly to moderately grazed. So this is the same sort of plot with how they're doing. So in this case, Canada actually has most of the global population, so we have about 76%. So they're a lot more in Canada than they are in the United States, for example. So we have a really high responsibility for the species for this one. And the Canadian population has declined by 74% since 1970, and an annual trend of decline of 3.3%. And special concern species. The next one is Sprague's pipit. So this one is listed as threatened on the Species at Risk Act. So it's a brown, plain-faced bird with a, people like to talk about like the big eye kind of look, like its eye is quite big, I guess, and it kind of looks like, but it has a pretty small head compared to its body. But yeah, like I said, you probably won't really, I think I've seen a couple in my life, so I do try to find these birds for a living, so yeah, they're very hard to find because what the males are doing is they're basically up really high in the air, like 200 meters up, and they're doing this huge aerial display flight. And basically they'll sing during bursts of gliding downwards. So I do see them sometimes like way up there, flying around to kind of figure out where they are eventually, but I've only seen a couple on the ground. And the song is what makes them really identifiable. So I'll play the song. I'm not hearing it. Oh, here we go. So this one is described as a cascading series of slurred jingling notes. For some reason I just think of like UFOs when I hear this one. So that's what works for me. So I think that's the thing, you just gotta figure out what works for you. But there isn't really anything else that sounds much like them. So here, maybe I'll play that. Do people want to hear that again? So for the habitat for Sprague's pipit, it's pretty similar to the barred sparrow, actually. So this is a site that had high Sprague's pipit density. It was like sort of a moderately grazed site, and Sprague's pipit is actually known as the Goldilocks of the prairie because they're looking for basically something that's like just kind of right in the middle. They're looking for vegetation that's not very tall, but it's also not very short. They're looking for some density, but it can't be like too dense. So they're looking for a little bit of litter, but not too much. So that's why they get that name. And I guess if the name of my talk might have not been very obvious, but this is really the species that made me want to kind of refer to like the porridge being too hot or too cold kind of thing. So they're really looking for something that's just right. And so for this species, it's declined by 91% since 1970, and it has an annual decline of 4.5%. And then, okay, this is the last species I'll kind of highlight. So this is the thick-billed longspur. It's listed as threatened by the Species at Risk Act. It's sparrow-sized and a little bit kind of like chunky. Males have this black breast and black cap. And they have the chestnut-colored wing patch. And then they're sort of like a gray overall. And then the females are sort of similar to the, when I talked about the chestnut-colored longspur, where they're sort of brown overall and not quite as distinct as the males. So while males are singing their song, and it's kind of like a sweet warbling song, they're also doing one of these display flights. So they're about 20 to 30 meters in the air, and they really parachute like down in kind of a spiral. And they're spreading out their wings and fanning their tail feathers while they do that. So it's really like tinkling, kind of warbling song that's pretty variable. Okay. Perfect. about their habitat. So they're really at this, this other end of the spectrum where they're looking for very short grass that has been really intensely grazed. They're actually kind of more of like a short grass prairie specialist, but when the grass is really intensely grazed where we are, it kind of mimics the type of vegetation they're looking for. And they're looking for very dry areas where there's no litter and actually patches of bare ground. So you can see that between those 4 species, they're all sort of looking for different things, and yeah, one size does not fit all. And so for the trends for this species, it's declined a lot, 90% since 1970, and annual trend of decline is 7.4%, and it's threatened. So beyond sort of like the natural growing conditions at a given location, disturbance can really affect the vegetation structure in grasslands. And grassland songbirds have evolved in landscapes that experience really frequent and variable levels of disturbance through processes like fire and grazing. And to suit them all, they sort of need a mosaic of different habitats. So often we find that grazing intensity is very variable within a paddock, just kind of due to different factors like the landscape or what plant community supported there. But in some cases, grasslands become really tall and litter accumulates without that disturbance. And some of these high priority species are no longer really suited to that. The habitat's not really suitable for them. So in those cases, some of these disturbances can be used to attract the species that are not present, especially for some of those species that really are facing disturbance, like the longspurs. So fire is an important part of the grasslands ecosystem, has existed on the landscape since time immemorial. There is a lot of benefits to prescribed fire that can affect the ecosystem. So shifting the composition of plants from non-native to native plant communities can be aided through fire. It can enhance the native plant seed production, attracts large grazers like bison and livestock, reducing fuel loads in the park, and fire also reduces the buildup of plant material on top of the soil, which allows light and heat to penetrate the ground, which can create better growing conditions for plants like sagebrush, which is an important vegetation for a lot of species at risk habitats. And then for grazing, it also offers some of these same benefits that fire does, so things like removing the grass and recycling nutrients. And we have both bison and cattle grazing in the park. Bison require a more robust style of fencing, which isn't throughout the park at this moment. In addition, bison are not really the best option for some of the grazing objectives that we might have, like doing more intense grazing to control invasive species. However, I guess it's kind of a balance, like bison are also a species of conservation concern, so our program aims to ensure the persistence of healthy, genetically viable, and diverse herd of bison. But we have And then just to kind of give you an image of how fire affects these landscapes, especially some years after. In the foreground of this image, it's an unburned area, but in the background, this area was burned. And this photo is about 1 year after the burn. The fire cycle is about 25 years for us, or the natural fire cycle. And currently the park is not meeting that objective. We're not close to the natural fire cycle. So this is sort of a general idea of how the grazing is broken up in the park. So we have a bison paddock in the west block of the park, and throughout the rest of the park, we largely have cattle grazing. And so that bison paddock is about 23% of the park, 18,000 hectares, and then, like I mentioned, the remainder, about 60,000 hectares, is grazed by cattle. And I just wanted to kind of go through an example, kind of making the connections between grazing, fire, and birds. So one of the areas that we're considering for a prescribed burn is this Three Sisters area, the bison paddock. So that area is circled on these maps with a red circle. And on the left side, you'll see this image of all these dots. So that's some bison collar data. It's from the spring season, but it doesn't really matter. Like basically, none of the bison don't graze this Three Sisters area currently. There's not an area they're grazing. And it doesn't really matter like this what the season is, like I mentioned. But there has been modeling that's been done to determine what forage is available for the bison based on a variety of factors. And so basically on the right-hand side, the more blue an area, or like sort of, yeah, blue is the best, but kind of green, and then yellow is the least for this carrying capacity. So there should be good forage availability for the bison in that area, and it should be able to support bison, but currently it's not, it's underutilized. And I just wanted to kind of give you an image of like what this area looks like. This isn't the whole area that's being considered for a prescribed burn, but this is stitched images from a drone. And basically all the brown areas in this image are like areas that have really high litter load. So this area has a lot of tall grass, a lot of litter accumulation. So yeah, it's not supporting grazing. There has been bird surveys in this area though. So I have two different kind of methods that I'm outlining here. So the one on the left, this data comes from bird recorders. So there's 4 surveys at each of these locations with the bird recorders in this area. On the right-hand side, I have in-person bird surveys. But it doesn't, the point is kind of consistent between both of them. This area, the species it's supporting, these are birds that really like tall, dense grass and litter accumulation, and at least some litter accumulation. So it's supporting those types of species right now, and it's not really supporting those species that seek the disturbance. So I guess if a fire is to go ahead in this area, it would probably bring a lot of these long spurs and species that are looking for more disturbed habitat. So currently it's really supporting, there's barred sparrow and grasshopper sparrows, bobbling through the in-person bird surveys, Sprague's pipit and western meadowlark. But yeah, like the species that like kind of more disturbed areas are not very prevalent here. So there's maybe a couple of chestnut-collared long spurs and horned larks, but not very many. And there's some species that altogether aren't in this area, so it doesn't have thick-billed long spurs because the grass is just too tall and dense for them. It doesn't have lark buntings, kind of for the same reasons, but it also doesn't have shrubs in this area, which that species is seeking. So yeah, those graphs are maybe a little complicated, but the vertical axis was kind of an abundance measure. But yeah, both types of surveys kind of say similar kind of community. Just wanted to go over kind of the distribution of the in-person bird surveys we've been doing in the park. So these surveys are designed to get densities to measure species recovery and inform management decisions, like fire and grazing. And so these sites are selected with a tool that kind of selects areas that are random but spatially balanced, so we have good coverage in the park. And from 2021 to 2024, we did 614 in-person bird surveys at 50 monitoring sites. inside the park. So these boxes are all monitoring sites. So usually there's 9 or 16 points. So someone will get up at the crack of dawn and go out to each of these points and spend some time at a point and count all the birds and then move on to the next point. So we have a pretty good data set here that we can go along with. And most of these points were done by us, Parks Canada, but we also had some assistance from Birds Canada and Canadian Wildlife Service as well. Just a bit of an overview. So this is like all the data together. We have broken it up different ways to look at responses to habitats and different disturbances, like grazing intensities, for example. But I just have all the data together here, just to give you kind of an overview of the types of species we get at the park. So we have really high densities of bird sparrow, chestnut-collared longspur, grasshopper sparrows, horned larks, Briggs pipit, vesper sparrows, western meadowlarks, and we also get some, occasionally we get bobolink and lark buntings and thick-billed longspurs as well. So we have another program at the park that uses songbirds as well, but this is sort of more of a measure of the condition of how the park's doing. And we have multiple measures that are like this. So it's called ecological integrity. So we have multiple ecological integrity measures at Grasslands National Park. These are designed to monitor components of the ecosystem for their intactness and likelihood for persistence. So it's kind of like, you can think of it almost like as an annual checkup for the park, like what you would do with your doctor. So it's kind of the park's annual checkup with a couple different measures to assess how things are going. So at Grasslands, these measures can range from riparian health, invasive alien plants, but also to things like how many burrowing owl nests there were this year. So it's pretty diverse. So songbirds are one of these measures. So we summarize the condition, so if it's good, fair, or poor, but also the trend. And so currently the program monitors the abundance of focal species and also the diversity at bird monitoring locations. And so for this program, bird recorders are used. So in the left side you can see what one of these bird recorders looks like. Where there's trees, they put these on trees, but where we have to put them on poles. And then from the bird recorders, they're getting these recordings that then people after the fact are going through and taking different bird species in the recordings. So on the right-hand side, this is called a spectrogram, so it's a visual representation, but you can use sound and visual representation to take the birds. So yeah, lots of activity to take in those recordings. And these values are compared to historical data that was collected at Grasslands National Park. So just going over sort of the condition part of this measure. So we've had the first 3 years it was assessed as fair, and then the last 4 years was good, and we'll have to update our 2024 one to see how things are going. And when needed, we do weight the abundance over the diversity measure, because we just have a bit more confidence in it for when those occasions happen, when they disagree. And then just going over the trend part of this. So in 2021, we had 5 years of data, so we were able to start assessing the trend. And the trend has always been increasing since we assessed it. Yeah, so they generally seem like they are going up a little bit, but things are pretty consistent. Yeah, for some reason, western meadowlarks are increasing. But for the most part, things are kind of staying sort of similar, but generally a little bit of an increase. So some future directions, we're starting to review these programs and just think about how to improve them. So thinking about refining our protocols, ensuring we have enough statistical power. We might start considering a wider suite of grassland bird species, be a bit more inclusive, ensure that our sites are representative of the habitat in the park overall, and also identify efficiencies. So I also want to talk about working with partners. So there's a program, a larger program that happens in a very widespread way that happens outside the park generally, called the Grassland Bird Monitoring Program. So this program was initiated by Canadian Wildlife Service in 2017 to improve species-specific spatial density models, and also contribute to improve regional status and trend estimates in the prairies by surveying large tracts of intact grasslands. And the reason they're surveying large tracts of intact grasslands is these are really undersampled by existing monitoring programs. So this was a big gap that they were filling. And the Grassland Bird Monitoring Program performs in-person bird surveys. They also deploy bird recorders. They install MODIS towers, and I'll talk about what that is. And they also capture birds and deploy MODIS tags. So I'll refer back to that. And then recently we started working more closely together as partners, and they wanted to actually include the park as one of their monitoring sites for the program. So luckily we're generally doing things in a similar way already, but we've made sure that our protocols are even more aligned so that we can compare our data. And then Birds Canada has also been collecting point count data for this program since 2021 and uses the same protocols as Canadian Wildlife Service. And they've really been able to increase their coverage into Manitoba and more Saskatchewan. So this isn't the best quality, but the yellow points are all the places that Canadian Wildlife Service has done surveys. Blue is Birds Canada, and then where we are circled, Grasslands general area, you can see that there's these purple collaboration points. So just to zoom in a little bit more, last summer we did points together in the east block of the park, and more of the area around there. And so we have quite a bit of data coming in through that program to assess sort of like how things are happening inside the park versus outside of it. So I said I would say what the MODIS work is. So MODIS is an international collaborative network that facilitates research and education on migratory wildlife using coordinated automated radio telemetry. So MODIS started in 2013 by Birds Canada. MODIS tags are radio tags that are deployed onto small flying wildlife. So it can be birds, bats, and even insects actually, like large butterflies and things like that. These basically, in order to detect these tags, MODIS receiver stations are set up, and each tag transmits a unique ID code that's on shared frequencies, which basically allows the detection of like a unique individual by a particular MODIS station. So you have this bird flying by a MODIS station, and these stations can detect wildlife from many kilometers away, like 10, 15 kilometers. So these birds basically, their tag is transmitting to the towers, and you can tell not only that there is something that had a tag, but also which tag it was. So it's telling you that you can find out where that bird got this tag and what species it is and all that kind of stuff. So MODIS has a shared database managed by Birds Canada and uses shared infrastructure, so all this information is shared together. And the tags on wildlife transmit signals that are detected by the network of receiver stations, so it really all works together. Locally, there's 4,000 MODIS stations that have been installed, and 54,000 MODIS tags deployed on wildlife. And primarily these stations are in North America, South America, Europe, and Australia, but North America has the most. In the middle, this is, so all these blue dots on the map are existing towers. And then the green ones are sort of have been planned out or prospective towers. So these are like the goal, I guess. So there's plans for the Motus Tower, like a Motus Tower fence across the Canadian prairies. So they basically want all these birds that have the tags to be detected sort of across the prairies while they're moving. The Motus towers can be installed in a variety of ways. So these can be like standalone towers, but they can also be associated with infrastructure. So the one on the left is just the tower is on the left side of the building. So that's pretty common setup, but then you can do things like apparently put them on top of grain elevators, like a chapel link. So very good signal up there, I'm sure. So this would provide information about the movement of wildlife, including species at risk. Motus towers help support research and collaboration efforts directly. Motus data can fill a lot of different knowledge gaps that we have, including like migration routes, stopover areas, wintering locations. And there's lots of outreach and education opportunities. I just want to talk about the Motus towers entirely a little bit. So not the best, but basically what I'm trying to get you to look for is these yellow dots on there. And I've just outlined the blocks of Grasslands National Park. So in 2021, we started to get some Motus towers in this vicinity. And then more and more towers have been installed recently, so it seems to just be continuing. And there's plans to expand and have a lot more of a Motus tower network in the prairies. And there's actually quite a bit, not Parks Canada, but other organizations that have a lot of funding in place to start installing these towers more and more. And it's an opportunity that the park is looking at, and there are other national parks that already have Motus towers. Okay, so I'm going to talk a bit about how changing climate affects birds. So we're relying on this, a report that was specifically produced for Grasslands National Park. That's assessing how the birds are doing in relation to this. And it's looking at suitability in 2050 for birds at the park under two different scenarios. So we're using the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Pathway. So that's the 8.5 scenario that you see on the right. So that's representing a 2-degree rise in temperatures worldwide. And then the 4.5 one on the left side, that's an intermediate emissions pathway, so that's incorporating some efforts to reduce emissions. So to give a broad overview of sort of what is being modeled for that 4.5 scenario, so for the park it would be about a 3 warmer on average throughout the year. And there would be more rain in the spring than there is now, but less in the summer. But there would also be more frequent weather events. And then the 8.5 is just more, it's even warmer and more extreme. So the model-based projections are done on how species distributions may change in response to these scenarios. And they're based on present climate tolerances of the species. So the colors are, so these are representing, like these have been assessed for a lot of species and how the climate suitability would be for them. So the blue is that there would be potential colonization by a species, then would be an improvement for them. Yellow is stable, orange is worsening, and then red is potential extirpation. So in general, so the vertical axis is the number of species, and I choose two different emissions pathways. So in general, with the change in climate, it's expected to alter the bird community in the park. With climate suitability projected to improve for some species, and be worsening for others. So it's not a consistent story, I guess, in general for all these species. It depends on the species. The park is expected to be less suitable for all of those 4 native prairie specialists that I talked about earlier. So for chestnut collared longspur, potential extirpation and worsening is about even. Bird sparrow and thick-billed longspur looking like a potential extirpation, unfortunately. But I had mentioned that it will be more suitable for some species. So some species that really stuck out to me that will see more suitability with the future climate are sage thrasher and lazuli bunting. So these are species that we really occasionally get right now, but not very commonly. Sage thrashers are a sagebrush flat specialist. And they choose kind of similar habitat to sage-grouse. So the sage thrashers on the left, so that's the one that really likes the sagebrush flats. And then lazuli buntings, they're kind of shrub specialists and go on field edges and that kind of thing. So, I mean, they're very cool birds. But yeah, not ones that we get very much now. And then I just wanted to talk also about Audubon has kind of a similar product that they produce with climate change reports. And they include how ranges of individual species are predicted to shift with different scenarios. So you can look up different scenarios for each species and get visualizations like this. So for bird sparrow, it would largely have a range loss. So the blue is where it would gain range. Yellow, if you can see it, is where it would be maintained. And then that red is where it would be losing range. So it really depends on the species. But yeah, those native prairie specialists generally have a lot of range loss, unfortunately. Okay. So I wanted to just go through a few resources that the park has, but also others. So we do have a bird watching webpage for the park that was recently done about a year ago. So go check that out if you're interested. Some resources to identify bird species and also record your observations if you're interested. So to identify bird species, there's an app called Merlin, and it does include some auto ID tools if that's of interest. There's also other bird ID apps, Audubon, iBird Pro, Sibley, lots of bird ID books out there, some that are Saskatchewan specific. Like Saskatchewan Birds and Birds of Saskatchewan, and also social media groups. There's a Birds of Saskatchewan group on Facebook that's very active and gives you kind of a good idea of the birds you might be seeing now. And then for recording your observations, there's eBird, iNaturalist, and then if you had a really rare observation, you might consider the Saskatchewan Conservation Data Center. With all these things, it's if you see something really rare, it's often a good type of photo or recording. But yeah, you can also just enjoy it for yourself as well. But contributing is always amazing too. Some acknowledgements. So from Grasslands National Park, there's been a lot of different people that have contributed, but I wanted to put up some names of folks who contributed in particular, and also acknowledging some of our external collaborators, Canadian Wildlife Service, and then we work also with Birds Canada and Wild Tracks is the platform we do our birds reporter interpretation on. And that's what I got. So.